Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to everybody here in person and to all the folks who are viewing online. And thanks for joining us today for the inaugural session of the Tax Policy Center's Distinguished Speaker Series. Today's event is being done in collaboration with our friends at the Tax Foundation, and we're happy to partner with Scott Hodge and the rest of the Tax Foundation team to bring you today's speaker. Kevin Hassett is no stranger to the Tax Policy Center. He's been working in public finance for a number of years. He's the 29th chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. And as an alum of the President's Council of Economic Advisors staff, it's indeed a pleasure to welcome Kevin here today. For those of you who may not know Kevin Hassett, he's a noted expert in public finance, receiving his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Kevin's widely published in academic journals, but also has a knack for translating complex economic thoughts into a way that broader audiences can understand. Prior to being confirmed as chair of the CEA, Kevin spent over a decade at the American Enterprise Institute, where he had several positions, including Director of Economic Studies, and most recently the James Q. Wilson Chair of American Culture and Politics. Kevin plans to speak for about 25 minutes or so, and that'll be followed by a Q&A session. To prepare for that portion of the program, I ask audience members to write their questions on the paper or card that's at your seat, and staff will come around during the presentation to pick those up, collect the questions, and then we'll be able to ask those of Kevin. And for those viewing online, please ask questions or share comments by emailing us using the address events@urban.org. And we encourage you all here and those online to share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And I'm pleased to see such a good turnout today. It looks like we have extra chairs being brought into the back. I look forward to a wide-ranging discussion. And let me turn the podium over to Dr. Kevin Hassett, Chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that kind introduction, and Scott for co-hosting the event, and all of you for coming, and those of you who are tuned in online for doing that as well. I've been in this room many times over the years, and I mentioned to Mark that the last time that I spoke here, I was discussing a book written by a guy named Thomas Piketty, and it was really quite a generous offer for me to come discuss Thomas's book, and it ended up leading to me getting an article published in the American Economic Review, and so I'll forever be grateful because I never would have started down a path that gave me that opportunity if I hadn't been invited here. I have to, so it turns out one of the transitions to being in public life is that you need to read your speeches. I guess those of you who've seen me speak know that I never do that. In part, it's because my eyes are not that good. I'm not very good at reading speeches, but the good news is I'm worse at writing speeches, so if I mumble a little, you're not going to probably miss much. But thanks for the introduction. And I have to start with this, that when the speech was scheduled, the Tax Policy Center had not yet released its report on the Big Six tax plan. And we had agreed that I would focus on taxes and economic growth. And as I discussed with Mark, I feel compelled to respond to the report, and I'll do so while continuing to pursue my original charge. I spent most of my life focusing on taxes and how taxes impact behavior. So I'm pleased to be here today to talk about the topic. I think you'd agree with me that taxes do impact the economy. Otherwise, neither of your organizations would exist. In other words, taxes matter. They impact the economy. It's scientifically, I think, indefensible, as the Tax Policy Center report does last Friday, to say that the framework, the tax framework that we're here to talk about, would have little macroeconomic feedback effect. I think it's simply inconsistent with mountains of evidence that I'm about to discuss to have no growth effects from the tax changes this significant. It's inaccurate. I think it's fiction. As for the static analysis released last week, to which I'll return later, I think it too is based on many fictions. I think that the Tax Foundation behaved responsibly when they decided to wait for the final details to analyze the bill. I'm sure many people in these halls have been struck and perhaps even dismayed by the tone and pushback from around Washington regarding the Tax Policy Center report. I think that's what happens when you behave irresponsibly. That's why the Tax Foundation decided correctly to wait for the complete plan. One of the most influential books in my life is Art Oken's Equality and Efficiency, The Big Trade-Off, which recently was republished for those online and able to click. I guess I'm not supposed to say that stuff now, right? But I get no benefit from that. But it's online, recently republished by Brookings at its 40th anniversary. And I'm sure many in this room have read it too and think of it as being important in their lives. Art was a former CEA chair and a longtime Brookings scholar, and argued that rational tax policy debate needs to account for the fact that redistribution is done with a leaky bucket. Art would probably be surprised to find that the Tax Policy Center now claims that the bucket doesn't have any leaks. But let's get back to tax reform and growth as Art would want. Let me start with a little history. In the U.S., federal income tax was born in 1913, over 130 years ago, after the founding of our nation. The top marginal tax rate on individual income has fluctuated quite a bit from its original 7%. It peaked at 94% during World War II and ebbed to a post-war low of 28% towards the end of Reagan's presidency. Today, the top marginal rate is 39.6, somewhere between its historical high and birth weight low. Throughout the century of the federal tax system in the United States, tax reforms have always been a bipartisan tradition. President Kennedy's tax initiative, signed into law by President Johnson as the Revenue Act of 1964, 2 years after I was born, lowered the top marginal rate on individual income from 91% to 70%. The legislation passed as a majority of Republicans in both houses of Congress joined a majority of Democrats in supporting the legislation. President Reagan's 1986 Tax Reform Act was signed into law when Democrats controlled the U.S. House of Representatives. Majorities of both parties, Democrat and Republican, voted in favor of a bill that President Reagan then signed into law. The top marginal rate fell from 50 to 28, and both sides viewed the development with favor. Bipartisanship has been good for tax reform, and tax reform, as we are about to see, has been good for America. Economists who studied the effects of taxes over time have developed a consensus that lower marginal tax rates and a broader base increase rates of economic growth and well-being. I've been in this room often over the past 20 years and have witnessed head nodding that broadening the base and lowering the rates, as President Trump's plan aims to do, is a recipe for better tax policy. I can't recall ever seeing anyone in this room argue that narrowing the base and raising rates was a recipe for growth. For years, Tax Policy Center analyzed tax bills without providing dynamic scoring. Now it provides dynamic scores, but the effects are zero. I suppose that's progress. This consensus is spread around the world as well, and it's been especially visible in the corporate tax space. In 1989, the year the Berlin Wall fell, the average statutory corporate tax rate imposed by central and subcentral governments in the OECD was 43%. In 1989, the comparable rate in the U.S. was about 39%. In the time since the wall fell, the OECD average corporate tax rate has trended downwards to its current 24%, about half its 1989 level. The U.S. corporate tax rate, however, is still stuck in the same place it was when the wall crumbled almost 20 years ago. We've seen the results of that stasis, which has essentially incentivized American firms to offshore and has kept foreign investment away and wages low. There's now a broad consensus in this country on both sides of the aisle that it's time to, shall we say, tear down this rate. Even President Barack Obama proposed lowering the federal corporate rate to 28%. My guess is that President Obama did not make that proposal because he thought it would have no effect. This bipartisan consensus within the United States echoes what policymakers around the world have learned. In France, a country not exactly known for its long-standing devotion to supply-side economics, President Emmanuel Macron has proposed cutting the corporate rate to 25%. And France's current corporate rate of 33% is already lower than ours. France joined such countries as Denmark, Sweden, and Greece, a country that recently elected an avowedly socialist government named the Coalition of the Radical Left of Syriza in Greece. They have a lower corporate tax rate than our own. Let me repeat that. Even the Coalition of the Radical Left in Greece, a country under deep austerity, understands that the bucket leaks. Against this backdrop, let's look at President Trump's unified framework for tax reform. First, the framework entails reforms to both the individual income tax and the corporate tax. On the individual side, President Trump's framework lowers the numbers of brackets to 4 rates, one for 0, one at 12, another at 25, and one at 35, and leaves the door open for an additional 5th higher marginal tax rate to ensure that the wealthy do not pay a lower share of taxes than they pay today. And don't forget, more people are eligible for the 0 rate under this plan. President Trump's plan retains incentives for home mortgage interest and charitable contributions, but otherwise eliminates itemized deductions in favor of a doubling of the standard deduction. In pursuit of simplification, the unified framework repeals personal exemptions, enhances the child tax credit by increasing its size and raising the income level at which it phases out, a reform that also eliminates the marriage penalty. Those who care for other dependents, like the elderly, will receive a new $500 non-refundable credit. The alternative minimum tax and the death tax will both be eliminated. The idea is to simplify the system and wasteful tax breaks and eliminate loopholes. It's a simpler, fairer system that increases the base and lowers the rates. The unified framework also brings reform on the business side. It lowers the statutory corporate rate from 35% to 20%, below the average rate of the OECD. Firms will be able to immediately write off the full cost of new investment and depreciable assets, for at least 5 years. The R&D and low-income housing credits will remain, but most deductions for C corporations will be eliminated at the discretion of the tax writing committees. And the deductibility of net interest expenses will remain only in part for C corps. The unified framework brings tax relief to the small and family-owned businesses conducted as sole proprietorships, partnerships, and S corporations. Their top marginal rate would be capped at 25%. Again, it increases the base, lowers the rates, something we all agree is good policy. The plan is pro-growth. On the individual side, it's pro-work. When you get more of an economic input like work, you get more economic output, and you get more economic growth. And on the corporate side, companies will no longer be incentivized to offshore, and what they save in taxes should help raise corporate investment and wages. So let's put this in perspective, given the bipartisan history I just discussed. On the individual side, we're broadening the base and lowering the rates, which is the approach that's received so much praise in these halls over the years. Given the overall revenue targets, Chairman Brady and Hatch are working with the professional staff and the members of their committees to place the brackets and other details at a fiscally responsible level. There are enough degrees of freedom that outside bodies like the Tax Foundation and the Tax Policy Center can easily use this time to opine about where the bracket should be and whether an additional top rate is needed and what that should be. For those of you in the audience, there are tools available online that you can use so that you yourself can score your own plan and see where you think the brackets could be and what the top rate should be to achieve those objectives. I encourage you to do so and to participate in the debate. It's hard to imagine a better setup for bipartisanship, but it would be better to opine making sure that growth effects are included, because as I mentioned at the beginning of my speech, if you don't believe tax rates push the economy one way or the other, then we might as well close up shop. On the corporate side, we're just responding to the global consensus that corporate tax rates are harmful generally, and particularly for the US, given how uncompetitive our rates are. You might have noticed over the years that I have some pretty strong views about the corporate tax and how much it ultimately ends up hurting American workers and their families. Perhaps the reason I hold these beliefs is that I started graduate school in 1984. And since you don't take topics classes until you get through the first year, I was taking Alan Auerbach's public finance class when the 1986 Tax Act was enacted. The teaching assistant in that class, who I desperately needed at least half the time, was Roseanne Altshuler, who at one point directed the Tax Policy Center. At the time I began working on how the 86 reforms would affect business capital spending, the literature surprisingly found little effects of tax policy on the economy, often suggesting that tax and interest rate variables just don't drive capital spending. There's a famous paper by Ben Bernanke about how the accelerator is the best way to predict investment. But Alan and I noticed something funny in the data. Politicians tend to pass investment tax credits in recessions, then let them expire when the recession's over. So it appears that the economy partly drove tax policy, not just the reverse. However, because recessions induce tax cuts, any analysis of how tax cuts affect the economy would need to separate this out, not to wrongly conclude, as many in the literature did then, that tax cuts cause recessions. When Alan and I discovered a way to overcome this endogeneity problem, I think a lot of commenters wanted me to take that word out. We found very large effects of tax policy on investment behavior. So since then, there's been a veritable scientific revolution of papers that use different methods to identify tax effects. And like our first study, they found again and again and again, and I could add a lot more agains, that tax policy is a major driver of economic growth if one does the science correctly. Controls for endogeneity. I don't have time to go into the scientific methodology in great detail, although I think that many in the room think I've already done too much of that. But I've written a number of recent review articles that I commend to you And for thinking about broad brush growth impact and the broad brush growth impact of the president's proposals, and remind me not to put broad brush in a speech again, that's really hard to say. A number of recent papers published in top journals provide a guide to the possible scale of the growth effects. Romer and Romer, and by the way, we're going to, hopefully, if I'm new to the job, if we navigate the website at the White House correctly and figure it out, we'll post this as soon as we can, and there'll be hot links to these articles. Romer and Romer utilize narrative history to separate tax changes with motivations unlikely to be driven by the business cycle out, and they estimate that a 1% point reduction in the total tax share of GDP increases GDP by about 1% on impact, and by about 2.5% or 3% over 3 years. Cloyne, Hayo, and Ull apply the same approach using data from the UK and Germany and obtain almost identical estimates. Other authors such as Mertens and Raven have extended this work with more sophisticated methods and found that a 1 percentage point reduction in the average personal income tax rate raises real GDP per capita by 1.4% in the first quarter and by up to 1.8% after a year. They further find that a 1 percentage point cut in the average corporate income tax rate raises real GDP per capita by 0.4% in the first quarter. Mertens and Olea find that in the first 2 years following a tax decrease of 1%, GDP is expected to be higher by about 1%. Applying these estimates to the proposed reduction in the statutory corporate income tax rate from 35 to 20 and the simultaneous introduction of full expensing requires calculating the effects of these changes and effects that they would have on federal tax liabilities, which will depend on the bill's final details. But to illustrate the scale of the effect, a rough preliminary estimate of the combined revenue effects of these proposals combined with the macroelasticities I just cited implies that tax cuts of this scale could lift GDP per capita by about 4% over the first year. Now, there are a number of reasons to expect that the actual impact of the reform would be much smaller than that, including the fact that we're currently near full employment. The potential for a significant growth effect is still very reasonable, though, and empirically valid. Approaching the question from a different angle, we can recall that a primary mechanism by which a cut in the corporate rate affects business investment is through the cost of capital. That's what Alan and I wrote about back then. The current consensus in the academic literature implies that a tax change that lowers the user cost of capital by 1% raises aggregate investment by between 0.5% and 1%. Calculating the effect on the average user cost of capital of reducing the statutory corporate rate to 20 and introducing full expensing depends on the values of lots of parameters and the final details of the bill. A reasonable range implies an expected short-term but sustained boost to capital spending and then GDP growth of much more than 1%. So I'll repeat it again. Existing evidence clearly indicates that taxes matter for the economy. Now, these estimates may seem implausibly large to some not familiar with the scientific literature. This is particularly the case when compared to results typically predicted by the so-called general equilibrium models that make sure that the movements in one market don't violate the basic laws of economics in another. But even these modelers are catching up. IMF economists Sandro Lizarazo and co-authors, I say and co-authors because I can't really pronounce their names so well, have developed a new dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model that generates growth effects from changes in individual income tax rates that are in the range of Mertens and Raven and Barrow and Redlich's results, providing reassuring replication by a modeling alternative. Interestingly, they find that their model is able to reproduce the observed macro effects when any budget shortfall is eventually made up for by cuts in government spending, but not if tax cuts today are reversed with tax hikes in the future. This suggests that modelers who care about the validity of the models with respect to the latest time series evidence should focus on those simulations. Simulations that assume that taxes will just be raised in the future to offset cuts today are inconsistent with the macro literature. There's another important factor to consider when thinking about how these changes will affect the economy. A recent NBER paper by Gouvenin and co-authors argues that profit shifting by large multinational firms causes part of their economic activity to be attributed to their foreign affiliates, leading to an understatement of U.S. GDP. Moreover, this profit shifting activity has increased significantly since the mid-1990s, resulting in an understatement of measured U.S. aggregate productivity growth. The authors correct for this mismeasurement by reweighting the amount of consolidated firm profit that should be attributed to the U.S. under a method of formulary apportionment. Under this method, the total worldwide earnings of a multinational firm are attributed to locations based on where their economic activity is. The authors use equally weighted labor compensation and sales to do this. And applying the formulary adjustment to U.S. multinational firms and aggregating to the national level, they calculate in 2012 about $280 billion would be reattributed to the U.S. by this method. Given that the trade deficit was equal to about $540 billion, this means that more than half the trade deficit is attributable to transfer pricing by U.S. multinationals, which drives up foreign income and increase imports. Extrapolating the 2012 finding to subsequent years shows that transfer pricing continues to account for at least half the trade deficit. And here's where it gets interesting. There's also a literature that looks at the relationship between tax rates and transfer pricing. That literature implies that a corporate tax cut to 20 would dramatically reduce the trade deficit and increase GDP accordingly, because they'd stop shifting the money abroad. Note that this effect happens totally within the current account for those into NIPA accounting, and I see at least 2 in the front row, and thus should be thought of as a change that would be part of a static score. The growth effects mentioned in previous paragraphs would be additive to this transfer pricing effect. Companies should bring their operations back with the certainty that tax rates are going to stay at a set level so they can invest those funds in America and American workers. Now let's go to the Wayback Machine. Let's look at the bipartisan President's Advisory Panel for Tax Reform, convened by President George Bush, W. Bush. It looked at a plan very similar to President Trump's unified framework for tax reform called the Growth and Investment Plan. On the business side, this plan lowered corporate rates and allowed for the full expensing of new investments, and lowered the top marginal rate on small business income below the top marginal rate on individual income. On the individual side, the plan created 3 brackets at low rates and repealed the alternative minimum tax. Does this sound familiar? The Treasury Department estimated that that plan would increase output by about 5%. Such an effect would be consistent with the latest empirical evidence. And looking beyond models and into the real world, the UK gives us a good example of a country that undertook corporate tax reform that lowered the rates and broadened the base between 2006 and 2016. The revenues collected through the British corporate tax over the time period, as corporate rates have fallen, have surged past British government forecasts. I hope that all of this has convinced you that the reputable scientific analysis based on the economic effects of taxes clearly suggests that this tax reform will fundamentally, positively alter economic activity in our country. I'm sure that there are some of you who believe the effects will be small, but even you have to admit that all of this evidence adds up to a chance, at least a chance, of something much, much better. Based on the scientific evidence, to me at least, it therefore seems prudent to adopt these reforms. Over the course of the Obama administration, U.S. corporate profits rose by a healthy 11% a year, but workers' pay didn't keep pace, and median wage growth was a paltry 0.6% per year. This disconnect between profits and wages is a radical departure from previous economic norms. In work we've been doing at CEA, workers used to get a 1.1% raise for every 1% increase in corporate profits. Now the pass-through to workers is closer to 0.4. So why did it change so much? Why did profits surge but not go into wages in the U.S. anymore? Because the profits are offshore, benefiting other nations' workers. In 2016, U.S. firms kept 71% of foreign earned profits abroad. What would happen if they didn't do that? A simple back-of-the-envelope calculation suggests U.S. workers in 2016 would immediately get a 1% raise. What if these firms didn't do that for the next 8 years? The median U.S. household would then get $4,000 more income. Or look at it another way. We know from several studies that high corporate tax rates serve to depress the wages of workers over the long run, through a combination of disincentives to bring profits home to invest and a reduced impetus for domestic investment in general. Those effects are felt across the income distribution, resulting in lower wages for higher and low-skilled workers alike. For the median household in the U.S., a top corporate marginal rate cut from 35 to 20% would boost wage growth almost fourfold, from the current 0.6% per year to as much as 2%, providing up to $7,000 of additional income over the medium term. It's time for a bipartisan consensus to use tax policy to fix wage growth. Now, I'm all for having a robust debate, as you can see from the fact that I'm standing here. So therefore, I'd be remiss if I didn't return one last time to Friday's report. I think we can all agree that the Tax Policy Center report did not, to say the least, contribute to the mood of bipartisan cooperation that's been so common in past successful attempts to reform the code. First, there are many parts of the plan that are still to be determined, yet the report chose to make assumptions and publish an analysis that's unlikely to have much to do with the final bill. To the extent that such imagined numbers are used to attack the process, which is happening, it would hardly be considered a constructive contribution. Second, the report ignored things about the bill that are publicly known. For example, the reconciliation instructions in the Senate that are under debate have made room for $1.5 trillion in statically scored net revenue cost. Yet the report makes assumptions that would deliver a score of $2.4 trillion. I just don't understand what the purpose of a document is that shows a score for one number when it's known there's agreement that the bill has to score something else. As my speech today shows, ignoring growth is also a big problem. This is a historic opportunity for tax reform, and we can't afford to squander it. It's also an opportunity to continue the historic tradition of working together in enabling tax reform. My hope is that we can all cooperate in a more nonpartisan fashion going forward, just like Tax Policy Center and the Tax Foundation did in agreeing to host me for this event. So thank you very much for your attention, and I now invite everybody else to the stage, and we'll do Q&A. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. Am I live yet? Am I hot? Thank you very much. And I think we want to go to questions because I know there are a lot of smart people here who are going to have some questions for Kevin. But perhaps we can give Mark a little chance to.
So my mic works, and we had agreed that Scott would ask the first question, but I suggested before the event that Mark have a chance to respond to my remarks, and so.
Sure.
Is yours working either?
Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay.
So a couple things. One, Kevin, obviously demand from the public for an analysis of the Big Six plan. And the Big Six have been working on this for 8-9 months, came out with a 9-page outline. Tax Policy Center filled in the blanks by referring to the Better Way program that the House had put out, which really the Big Six plan is based on that template. And also looking at some of the Trump administration releases that have come out and talked about the plan. I think the results presented by Tax Policy Center point out a couple of features of the Big Six plan. One, much more emphasis put on tax cuts than tax and revenue raising items, which is why you get a $2.4 trillion net number for tax cuts. And second, a number of the largest tax cuts either exclusively or primarily benefit high income people, estate tax repeal, AMT repeal, corporate tax cuts, and a special rate for partnerships that is a special maximum rate for flow-through entities. So really I think that TPC points out how the Big Six plan could be modified to meet the president's goal of a large middle-class tax cut and no tax increase or no tax cuts for high-income people. And so I guess the question I have is, what types of changes can we expect to the Big Six plan that would help it meet the administration's goal, and when can we expect them? Because we will be doing the analysis as they come out.
So about your statements of fact from the study, I think I've said what I want to say about the study. About the process that, for me, it's hard to imagine a better setup for bipartisan tax reform than one where they've stated a desire for fiscal responsibility. They've stated that they expect Congress to weigh Art Oken's equity and efficiency in a prudent way and set the brackets and even talk about the top rate in a way that produces a bill that can pass. Frankly, I have an enormous amount of respect for the Big Six and for President Trump. When's the last time you saw a Republican put the top rate on the table like that and agree that we need to let them work it out? And so, I look forward to what they come up with, and it's part of a deliberative process where people, from the right and from the left are going to have to weigh equity and efficiency and think about what the benefits are. But again, if you look at any reasonable, take the low ends of the literature, any reasonable wage effect from this corporate tax and the transfer pricing is going to have a really big effect on the welfare of America's workers. And so just looking at static scoring without economic growth, I think, would be a bad thing to look at if you're deciding whether you should support the bill.
Yeah, and I don't want to pile on. I'll just kind of tell you what our policy has been in scoring any proposal. And all of the candidates and members of Congress that we've worked with over the last couple of years, we have a strict policy that we will not release any analysis of their plan unless they post it live on their website or another published form, so that others, such as Tax Policy Center and whomever, can validate and see exactly what was scored, so that we are not privy to any private information that lent us to score it one way or the other. Everything has to be very visible, very transparent. Otherwise, we don't think that we're doing justice to what's being scored. So that's kind of been our policy. That's why we didn't score or analyze the framework, because, hey, we're waiting like everyone else for the details to come out of Ways and Means and Finance, and that process has to go forward. So with that, perhaps we can return. I do want to maybe stick to this just for a minute, if I can take the liberty, on the wage growth. There's so much attention that seems to be placed on just cutting taxes and trying to measure, well, who's going to win and who's going to lose, but forgetting this sort of second element of it, and that is the fact that there are millions of people out there that haven't seen a wage increase in more than a decade. And stagnant wage growth has been one of the key issues that have concerned so many people. And maybe if you could talk more specifically about some of the key areas of this plan that potentially will drive wages, what can we expect again, and where that process might go.
Yes, thanks for the question. And this is, for me and for President Trump, a very high priority. President Trump talks about getting to 3% growth, but he cares desperately, of course, as much getting to higher wage growth. And I think that let's put out our economist hats again and step back and think about what's going on with the current corporate tax. That right now we've got a system, and I think this is something where many people at TPC and Tax Foundation agree with me, that has a very high statutory corporate tax rate, but many multinationals just don't pay it. It's almost become a voluntary tax, because if you set up a subsidiary someplace that's low tax, that is pretty easy to pay, to take something, have the sub make something that should cost $5, but pay $20 for it, and you just move $15 in income to a low tax place. But when you do that, then you're paying $20 for the import, right? And so the question is, well, is that just accounting? And the way in which it's not accounting is twofold. First, if you look at the operations, say, in a country like Ireland, Hassett's an Irish name, I don't mean to beat up on them, but if you look at a place like Ireland, then in order to get the money to Ireland, then a lot of times you have to put the operation there. And so you're locating profits in Ireland, and that's benefiting workers in Ireland. And so we have a system where we're not actually getting much money from these guys because they're creating jobs overseas. And so I ask you, in a setting like that, what percentage of the corporate rate is borne by U.S. workers? Well, I think it could be infinity, right, if you really think about it, at least in an economic model, because we're not getting any revenue, and there's lower labor demand in the U.S. because we moved the jobs to Ireland. And so we think that if we move the jobs back, that would have a big positive effect. But there's something else that I think is really important, and this goes back to a labor literature that was really hot when I was in grad school, and I haven't actually checked in to see if people are still writing on this, but there was this puzzle in the literature back when I was in grad school, taking a labor class from Paul Taubman, that called the Inter-Industry Wage Differential Puzzle. And the basic idea is that even like, say, low-skilled people like the janitors in companies that are highly profitable benefit from the profits of that company. And so if you look at like where the profits are, then you'll find wage variation that is a little inconsistent with what we had in our labor models when we were studying labor economics in grad school, so that the salaries of people by occupation aren't equalized across industries, because if you work for Google, you're going to make a lot more money. And so what we've done is we've taken our most profitable companies in the country, and we've let them just move all their profits offshore to avoid U.S. tax, and so that like loses this inter-industry wage differential effect as well. And I think if you look at both those effects, the numbers that I cited in my talk are very reasonable estimates of what might happen if we could just make it so that this game was stopped.
Okay. We're getting a lot of questions on that point, so I want to, maybe if I can follow up, will corporations stop shifting profits? Will we see a lot of that? And what industries might you expect would repatriate a lot of their foreign profits back to the U.S., and how would that affect investment and so forth?
I see a lot of people in this room that have been at conferences on international tax, both at AEI and here at Brookings over the years. And there's some debate in the literature about this, and I'm a little agnostic about which end of the elasticity curve you need to go to, but Jim Hines had an early paper where he ran a big regression where he just had the location of multinational income by country and then regressed that on a bunch of variables and tax rates and found really, really big elasticities that people can move the money around incredibly responsibly. So imagine if Ireland increased its rate to 25%, then pretty quickly the money would move someplace else. And then other people have criticized the early literature by using microdata and looking at specific firm level data and found elasticities that are smaller. But even those elasticities are big enough so that you could get really big wage effects from the moving around of taxes. I think that the interesting thing that the literature hasn't advanced enough for us to precisely estimate is that if you look at the fact that we go from 35 to 20, then you might expect that that would have a differential impact on transfer pricing that might occur to countries that have a 25% rate versus an 11% rate, and that we might sort of get all the revenue that's currently transfer priced to rates above 20, but less below. And that's a kind of like nonlinearity in the response that we don't have a lot of information on. But I think that it suggests that the amount of money that could come home is maybe bigger than you would even get from some of these location decisions because of the sort of trigger effect of getting a rate below that.
Okay. We have a question here from Andrew saying that there are many mentions in the speech today of bipartisan elements in the unified plan. But so far, the plan was built by a partisan group, and the plan is to run it through a partisan reconciliation process. How does the administration plan to bring Democrats to the table, and is there room to pair tax reform with infrastructure?
I think everybody hopes that there's a bipartisan effort. I was pleased that there was a bipartisan support for me. I got 81 votes. I didn't know that was necessarily going to happen. So I've seen that it's possible. I was actually when you go through that process, you need basically a psychiatrist standing by at all times, right? But for me, the moment that I felt the best about was that there was one day where I was being really aggressively attacked by Senator Warren and Ann Coulter at the same time.
We have a couple questions that are very similar, and boy, it's hard to know which way to go. We'll get to all of them. Do you agree with Mnuchin and Cohn that tax cuts will be paid for through economic growth alone? And there are a couple here that are similar.
Yeah, I think that
Or I mean, obviously, some tax cuts affect the economy differently. I mean, that's what we've tried to use our macroeconomic model to teach members of Congress that most tax cuts don't pay for themselves, and you have to. This is why we use this tool so that we can understand the differences between them.
Yeah. So thanks for that second part of your question, because it gives me a chance to go back to Art Oken again. That I think that at least the state of Kent Smetter's model and so on is that the bucket doesn't leak, and I disagree with that. I stated that, and so I don't think that you can talk about inequality only. So that you have to talk about inequality and efficiency and understand that there's a trade-off. I think that there are a lot of people on the right that only talk about efficiency, that they never talk about inequality, and that it's like growth is just going to fix everything, right. And we don't have to worry about so for sure if you have different tax rates it redistributes some, and so I'm a person who thinks you need to talk about both of those.
But there's a big difference between a child tax credit and full expensing in terms of their effect on the economy.
Right, but if the full expensing and the corporate rate of 20 gets us to a world where the activity's here and then we're increasing the demand for workers and getting an extra $7,000 in wages, then that's something we ought to factor into our analysis when we're thinking about inequality. And that's the part that I think that's missing so far from the analyses that I've seen. As far as agreeing with Secretary Mnuchin and Gary Cohn, absolutely 100%. This is a plan that I think is going to dynamically scored is going to have to balance. And I think that the dynamic scoring device that's relevant for that is probably going to be the Joint Tax Committee's MEG model. I guess that's the one they're going to use. Maybe they'll pick a different one. But I think that the modelers out here know that the model that would do dynamic scoring is a pretty conservative model. It has generally much smaller dynamic effects than, say, the tax foundation model, which I think is a conservative model, in two ways, right?
Here's a question coming from one of our online viewers. They said, you mentioned the framework allows for an additional top rate to ensure the wealthy don't pay a lower share of taxes. Is the addition of the word share of taxes new? Previously, we've heard the administration say the wealthy won't pay lower taxes in an absolute sense.
Yeah, I actually would ask those at home and those in the audience to grant me economist license. That if you think that something I said today broke news about what's in the plan, then it didn't. It's just that I spoke like an economist rather than someone who's on talking points, and so I characterize the way I understand what's going on.
Here's a question we get an awful lot as we talk to members of Congress and we get calls from our friends in the states. What's going to happen with the state and local tax deduction, do you think? And what is the broader impact of this tax reform on the states to the extent that we understand what's in it?
Yeah, sure. So the plan calls for the elimination of that, and I think that there's a good economic reason for that. Again, it's broadening the base, lowering the rates. I think that basically the federal income tax code shouldn't favor apples over oranges, and that we should just encourage people to go about their business and intervene with the federal tax code as little as possible. And that's how you maximize economic efficiency. And so I think that if states want to, I love to go sometimes in the summer down where my wife grew up near Bethany Beach. Bethany Beach has this great bandstand where they have a band go out and give concerts and stuff like that. Presumably the people of Bethany decided that they want to tax themselves and have a band. And then maybe there are other towns where they don't have a band. It's actually probably a pretty efficient way to supply music to people, right? Because it's tax advantaged. But that's exactly the point. That we should just get the government out of those decisions, let the state and local governments decide how much they want to spend based on what services they need and that the local people demand. This goes back to Charles Thibault, right, who suggested that efficient government requires that people vote with their feet and go to towns that provide the services that they like to see, and to have the federal government subsidize the towns that provide really, really expensive services seems to me like a bad economics.
Okay. Here's a question from Kim, talking about corporate taxes and burden of labor. A two-part question. One, can you address the Treasury report on the impact of corporate taxes on labor that's been removed? And two, is it really reasonable to say that labor gets 100% of the benefit of a corporate tax code?
Yeah, thanks. I don't know anything about the decision to remove the study. I've not read the study. I think that if it...
Really good.
Yeah, okay. Did you write it?
It was in National Tax Journal. No, I did not write it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, but I think that if the answer is that labor bears 18%, then I would certainly disagree with the findings, but I'd be happy to go through the details and the economics of why I think that's a bad call. I think I've done a lot of that today. Mm-hmm. Again, if you're a firm that's purely domestic in the U.S. and you operate here and you can't transfer price your stuff anywhere, then that's a completely different ballpark from if you're a firm with lots of intellectual property and all your profits are in Ireland. And I think that for the former firm, in that kind of a world, which is the world in the sort of old Harbinger model and the kind of things that we used back when I was in grad school, then a labor share like that makes more sense. But in a world where transfer pricing moves the profits abroad, we don't get any revenue out of these guys, and they do that by driving up wages in Ireland, then I think 18% is really, really low. And I'm comfortable with numbers that are much larger than that. I think Bill Randolph had a CBO study where he got up to 70%, and maybe that's still a little bit low for multinationals at least, but I think that's a very reasonable number given the literature.
Here's an interesting question from Steve Enton, and get into a point I think that may have been you try to emphasize in your talk, is does the beneficial effect of lower corporate tax rates on the trade and current account deficit reduce the concerns about our trade agreements?
I think that there's a multi-track approach to the trade problem, and I agree 100% with the president, who's probably taken some heat in circles like this. But like if you look at those trade deals, I was talking to Austin Goolsbee once on TV about this when he was defending President Obama, his position on trade deals back in 2008, and he said, look, if Kevin and Austin were going to write a trade deal, that it would be one sentence. It would be free trade. But if you look at the trade deals, it's 10,000 pages. And so, President Trump's position is that there's a lot of stuff in those 10,000 pages that we can improve. And frankly, I don't think that there's anyone respectable that should argue with that. If you actually dig into it, which I've done a little bit since I've moved in, I think that trade The trade deals need to be improved, that there's stuff that we've given away over the years that doesn't make any sense to give away, and I'm glad that there's really good guys working at that while we're doing this. And I think that the two approaches could be really quite complementary, and if both approaches are successful, then it should definitely restore our confidence in the idea that we can build an economy that's really friendly to American workers.
Here's a question from Bob. Arguably, the least defensible itemized deduction is that for home mortgage interest. Why is that not on the Big Six chopping block ahead of the state and local tax deduction?
I guess that the Big Six decided what they did on the home mortgage interest deduction based on complex negotiations. The home mortgage interest deduction is a subsidy for home ownership. I think that there is an economic literature that suggests that that subsidy has some economic merit because of the external benefits to home ownership. That when people own homes as opposed to renting, they keep the neighborhoods up better and so on. And so I support that as well. I think that the big increase in the standard deduction might reduce somewhat the number of people that are claiming the mortgage interest deduction. And there's even like an industry group out there that put out a study attacking the plan already because they said it would undermine home prices, something that it's really not good analysis. We could go into that. But I think that the mortgage interest deduction is a key part of the plan. I think a lot of people use it to own a home, and since there are external benefits to owning a home, I think economists should support it.
Well, this question is proof that we don't only have economists in the audience. David Jory, a friend of ours, a tax practitioner, asks, Professor Wells at Finance this week urged a surtax on all multinational cross-border payments and dumping 482 and the arm's length method. Good idea to get rid of homeless income and earning stripping?
I think that the international
we had to give the tax lawyers at least one question.
Yeah, we have to, on the international tax code, there are a lot of moving parts. I think of there being two problems. There is a little less than $3 trillion parked overseas. It's not necessarily really overseas, it's in the bank accounts of the subsidiaries. The Irish sub has a bank account in New York maybe. But it's parked overseas, and if we change the code fundamentally, that money expected to eventually have to pay a 35% rate. And so we have to pick a rate that allows the money to come home, and that'll be part of the negotiation. And the second part is this, half the trade deficit that's being transfer priced overseas that would be a flow that could come home, the next year and all the years after that. And I think that keeping an eye on those two targets, the committees are studying the issues and deciding what to do about the rules in question. And I think that the process that the Big Six have come up with for this is exactly the right process. That right now, on the efficiency and equity points, they're talking about it. Where do we put the brackets? On the international tax code, they're talking about the pluses and minuses of whether we move this to here or there.
Another question coming in on benefits to American workers. So the proposal is all about benefiting the American worker. It says, please be specific. Given almost full employment, then the result must be better jobs. Where will those jobs be? What companies will those employees work for? And how does this square with the ongoing effort of companies to shed low-wage jobs and contract out things like the janitors you talked about?
Thanks for that question. It's a really great question, and it reminds me. Is it your question?
No, it wasn't mine.
No, I was talking not to you. I was talking to them.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it would never be nice to you. I mean, but it reminds me of that moment where I had to take my teenage son down and talk to him about where wages come from, and if he was in the room, he'd kill me right now. The fact is that if you want to have a higher wage 2 years from now, then you need to invest in human capital, get smarter, come here and listen to economists. Or you have to, show up at work and have more machines to work with, in which case your productivity will be higher, and that'll drive up your wage. We could talk, if someone really wants to, about the connection between productivity and wages and whether it's broke down, and there's stuff like that. But basically, the bottom line is, for wages to sustainably be higher, then workers need to either be smarter, better educated, or to have more capital. We could talk about the education part. The president has a big agenda for that part. But on the tax side, I think that we've done something that's exactly targeted right at the problem because it's encouraging firms to locate capital in the U.S., which should increase labor productivity, which should drive up wages.
I promise that this question is not from a tax foundation economist, but I'll ask it anyway. Jesse Vogel asks, curious about the 5-year temporary full expensing component of the framework. Basically, won't a temporary nature of the provision lead to temporary results?
I think that that the Big Six decided on the temporary expensing in part because they wanted to be attuned to the fiscal responsibility issues, and honestly, there's sort of weird treatment of things in the scoring rules in the Senate that basically if I buy a 7-year machine in the 6th year, then by going to expensing, then since some of the depreciation was outside of the budget window, then it looks like I've done something that's a big cost. But if I buy a 7-year machine in the first year, if I go to expensing, it doesn't have a big cost. And so that there's stuff in the way that things are scored that can sometimes make it that you have to make tough decisions, like making things that you'd really like to be permanent be temporary. I was not in the room when these decisions were made, but could I finish about the temporary thing? In the end, the way taxes enter these models is that they change the long-run target capital stock. If there are adjustment costs, then it takes a while to get to your long-run target. And so if you want to really boost investment now, then you want to really lift the long-run target capital stock. And it could take like 5 or 6 years or 7 years to get reasonably close to the long-run target. And so the expiration does change the long-run target capital stock and make it a lower trajectory. There's an offsetting effect, which is in the user cost formula. If you've got the formula in front of you at home, it's like the delta gamma effect, it's called in the literature, but the delta gamma effect is just that when there's an expiring provision, then you have an incentive to do stuff now so that you get it while you have the tax benefit. And so that effect could lift investment in the front end if the expiration were really believed by investors to happen.
Just maybe a quick question about the Byrd rule is going to play a big part in this, and to what extent does that kind of frustrate the economics of designing a pro-growth tax reform plan?
My very first paper ever in my career was really about expectations of future tax policy, and the problem back then that I was looking at was that if you are trying to run a regression where you put in expected future tax policy, then the way economists were doing it at the time was that they were using regressions to predict future tax policy. But since future tax policy was really not very well predicted by regressions, then they had no power to detect tax effects because the expectations of future tax policy were really difficult to model. And in part it was because recessions back then were kind of unpredictable. They happened sometimes, because they shut the Suez Canal or something like that historically. Yeah, that was one. And then taxes change in recessions. And so back when I first looked at it, there was a tax change of some significant amount about every 3 or 4 years. And so what exactly future expected policy is a very, very difficult thing. But I think 100% you're right, and I know this is something the Tax Foundation has emphasized over and over, even in a paper that just came out, that permanent policies lift the target capital stock higher. You don't get that lump, and so therefore they're preferable.
Here's a question from Chris. How can the administration tout the dynamic effects of a tax plan, but also contend there's too little detail to conventionally score it?
No, that's a good question, and I struggled with it just while looking at my talk. But if you think about the user cost of capital, then there's one parameter that still, according to the Big Six plan, is relevant and not firmly established, and that is the haircut on the interest deduction. That I don't think we know exactly where the committees are going to come down and what that should be. If you look at the equations, the interest deduction is in there, and what the haircut is would affect the result. And so, when I analyze it, I'm willing to say what happens to the equity cost of capital, because it's not influenced by that, but not the debt cost of capital. And so in the analysis that I presented in my talk, there were judgments like that were made that made it so that my analysis was true to the things that we know. and did not make assumptions about things that we don't know.
Two questions, going back to the international provisions and somewhat related questions. What are your thoughts on a global minimum tax that's proposed in the framework? And are there other options to be worked out to prevent base erosion? And obviously, I'm sure that the committees are studying this pretty.
Yeah, that sort of goes back to the economist license in the sense that if you think I broke some news on these things, then you misheard me. That this is something they're working out. Yeah. There are a lot of different ideas about how to do it, and base erosion is an important issue. But it's a lot easier to deal with that kind of an issue if you have a 20% rate than if you have the highest rate on earth. If people are transfer pricing their profits to a country run by the radical party of the far left, then maybe you should cut your tax. And then when you do, then they won't necessarily be transfer pricing their profits to that country anymore.
So a question from Harry, obviously a Kevin Hassett fan, saying, last year you wrote an article on National Review titled, "We Ignored the Debt at Our Peril." With that point of view, shouldn't reform be at least revenue neutral on a static basis so that any growth that occurs reduces the deficit?
I think it's a fair point. In fact, I remember that article well. Because I think Joe Sullivan, who's here, worked with me at AEI and is now working with me at CEA, made like the best chart ever. I can remember it was a really interesting chart with flags and stuff for the different countries. But I think the debt problems are severe, that we're short. What's the latest estimate? You probably know is like 100 trillion in present value or something if we count everything. Okay. And I think that the president views it as a multi-stage thing, and that the first order of business is to get from 2% growth back to a rate that we're used to seeing. I can tell you that there's a lot of scientific evidence that a tax reform like this would help accomplish that, but it would also make sure that it was equitable growth, because it's going to drive up capital formation in the U.S., drive up wages, and accomplish things that I think that everybody in this room would love to be able to accomplish. I think once we've done that, then looking at the long-run problems is certainly something that eventually we're going to have to do, mindful of the fact that the more you put off long-run reforms, then the harder it is to do in the future.
Tom asked an interesting question I've seen raised in some of the media as well. I'll sort of paraphrase, but we're in the 8th year of a recovery. The job markets, there's not a lot of slack there. He mentions that we've had 3% growth in the second quarter, and every recovery is in with some sort of overheating. So can you expect a lot of growth from a tax plan where the economy is already at nearly full employment, et cetera?
This is a really great question because it gets to the heart of the problem. That capital stock growth investment over the last 8 years has been really terrible. It's been terrible even lately. There's even like just a negative year for investment growth. And the labor force is still like lower than we would like. There are a lot of people out of the labor force. Perhaps they were discouraged because of unemployment during the Great Recession. Perhaps they've got substance abuse problems. Many reasons why people would be out of the workforce, including doing so voluntarily because they could afford to. But if we want to just have a labor-driven recovery, which is something that's been happening so far, then we are at the point where nationwide, we're going to have to draw more people into the labor force in order to continue growth, even at the rate that we're seeing. And I can tell you that that's something that people at the White House are very much paying attention to. But my view is that the capital part of the equation is a big opportunity right now, because capital stock growth has been low. And we know why. It's because you should put your factory in some other country in order to get the profits there. And if we can just reverse that, then we can get the capital stock growth we need to sustain the recovery and even make it accelerate a little bit. Also notice that if you increase wages because workers are more productive, because they've got more capital, then that's not like the kind of inflation that predicts the end of a recovery. And so I think that now is the time, really, to do this. And the final point on wages, and I'm sorry that I carp on this so much, but going all the way back, I got 2 papers on wages in my dissertation. And I've been thinking about it for a long time. But the final point on wages is that when I look at the history of wages, post-war history of wages in the U.S., and we saw this in the 90s, that the time when middle and low-income people see the best increases in wages, tends to be about now in a recovery. And we're seeing that. That because, like, you go to Colorado, I was looking at the numbers, someone will tell me I got it wrong. If I get it wrong, there's the someone. But I think that right now there's about half a unemployed person in Colorado for every job listing, right? And so what that does is it encourages people to come in, but it also tells employers that, well, if you want to be the one who gets that person, then you got to offer a higher wage. And but going back, very often we have periods in U.S. history where, just like the last 8, where people at the bottom, like, they don't see the wage growth. And when they get the wage growth, which we saw especially in the hot economy of the 90s, is precisely now. If we can keep this recovery going for 2 or 3 years, I think we can expect enormous wage growth at the bottom of the income distribution. And so it's really incumbent on us to pursue policies like the President's plan, because we need that capital stock growth to keep the recovery going. And I think with that, I actually have a hard stop at 10:30.
You've been very generous with your time. We
thank you so
appreciate you
much.
coming.
Thank you so much.
You draw a big crowd.
Oh.